Story 1. Headlights Through the Fog. I remember that night like it was etched into my skin. I was driving back from a friend's cabin outside Boone, North Carolina, the road winding and narrow, barely wide enough for 2 cars to pass. It had been raining earlier, and now a thick fog rolled down the mountainside, so dense that my headlights barely pierced more than 10 feet ahead. The tires crunched over damp leaves, the smell of wet pine and earth thick in the air. I'd been alone for hours, the silence of the forest pressing in, the only sound of my own breathing and the occasional rustle of something moving just out of sight in the underbrush. My mind was already on edge, thinking about the long drive ahead and how exhausted I felt. There was an uneasy calm, the kind that makes your nerves tighten without warning. I remember seeing it just before my heart nearly stopped. A figure, standing dead still in the middle of the road, illuminated only by the dim beam of my headlights. At first, I thought it was someone hitchhiking or a traveler stranded in the fog, but there was something off, something unnatural about how still it was. No swaying in the wind, no reaction to my car approaching, just a shape, vague in the mist. I slammed on the brakes, tires skidding slightly on the wet leaves. My chest felt like it would burst and my hands shook as I fumbled to put the car in park. For a moment, I just stared, trying to convince myself it was a tree stump, a discarded log, anything that would make sense. But then the outline, human though I couldn't see any features, shifted slightly, just enough to make my stomach lurch. I got out of the car, heart hammering, ears straining. The fog swallowed the beam from my headlights almost immediately. I squinted, taking a few tentative steps forward, the dampness soaking through my shoes, leaves and mud clinging to my soles. There was nothing there. Not a person, not an animal, not even a branch that could have cast a shadow that way. Just the road, slick and glistening, and the trees standing like silent sentinels around me. I exhaled shakily, telling myself it must have been my imagination, the stress, the fog playing tricks. But then I saw the footprints. They were faint impressions in the wet earth, human-shaped, leading from the middle of the road into the trees. The tracks were uneven, hurried, as if the person had turned and bolted into the forest. I followed them instinctively, curiosity mixed with a gnawing sense of dread. The prints disappeared after a few steps, swallowed by the mud and leaves, and the fog seemed to thicken as though the forest itself were closing in on me. I turned back toward the car, feeling that growing sense of being watched, of eyes tracking me from the shadows between the trees. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made me jump, but there was nothing there when I looked. I climbed back into the car, hands trembling as I fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life, a sound that felt impossibly loud in the quiet. I sat there for a moment, listening, trying to shake off the feeling that I hadn't been alone, that someone, or something, had been watching me the entire time. Then, almost imperceptibly at first, the radio crackled. Not the usual static, not the background hum that comes when you pass an area with weak reception. This was different, a faint whisper, barely audible but distinct enough to make my stomach knot. It sounded like my name. Jake. I froze, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. It wasn't a voice I recognized. It was low, urgent, yet distant, as if carried on the wind. The static swelled, then cut out entirely, leaving me with nothing but the wet roar of the tires against the road. I told myself it was a hallucination, the result of isolation and fatigue, but the dread wouldn't let go. Every instinct screamed that something was wrong, that the forest had eyes and I was the only one under its gaze. I glanced in the rearview mirror. Nothing, just fog and shadowed trees stretching back into the distance. My heart was still racing, every nerve ending alight with fear. I slammed the car into drive, trying to put distance between myself and wherever, or whoever, I had just seen. The fog clung to the road like a living thing, curling around the headlights, slowing my progress, obscuring every landmark. I tried to focus on the road, tried to tell myself it was just a strange, isolated moment, but a sense of being followed lingered in every nerve. I slowed briefly at a bend, thinking I saw movement at the edge of my headlights. Something, or someone, was standing between two trees just beyond the glare. I blinked, and it was gone. No sound, no disturbance, nothing. Just the dense, unbroken fog. My pulse felt like it would tear through my chest. I kept driving, but my mind kept replaying that moment over and over. The still figure, the way it didn't move naturally, the way it seemed almost wrong. And that whisper, I couldn't get it out of my head. Jake, calling me back, calling me forward, it didn't matter. It was there, lingering in the darkness. As I continued down the trail, the road narrowed, twisting through the Appalachian ridges, and I realized I had no idea where I was. The landmarks I thought I knew were swallowed by the fog. Every turn looked the same. Every shadow seemed to move just at the edge of my vision. I tried to concentrate on the hum of the engine, the tires on the slick leaves, anything to ground myself, but the feeling of isolation pressed heavier with every mile. The forest seemed alive in a way that didn't make sense, responsive, aware. I imagined footsteps in the mud behind me, slow, deliberate, always keeping pace, always just out of sight. I told myself I was being paranoid, but the fear wouldn't leave. Then the whisper came again, louder this time, and I jerked my head toward the passenger seat. There was nothing there. No one had climbed in behind me, but I could feel it, the presence, the sense of proximity, that unmistakable weight of being watched. The radio crackled violently, the static now deafening, and I swerved slightly, tires slipping on the wet leaves. My throat went dry, panic setting in, and I pressed the accelerator harder, praying the fog would lift, that the trail would open into a familiar road, that I'd see the glow of the highway ahead. But the forest didn't relent. It seemed endless, every bend and hill repeating itself as though I was trapped in some cyclical nightmare. I remember thinking about the footprints again, about how they had led into the trees and vanished without a trace. And then it hit me. There was no reason for them to end. Whoever, or whatever, had left them was still out there, somewhere in the forest, just beyond the edge of the fog. My stomach twisted as I realized the isolation wasn't just physical, it was psychological. I wasn't alone in the mountains, not really. The place had a memory, a way of watching, of marking trespassers, and somehow it knew I was there. Minutes or hours, I couldn't tell, passed as I wound down the trail, the fog finally beginning to thin slightly as I descended toward a stretch of road I recognized, but the relief was short-lived. Every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, every shadow at the edge of the headlights, I expected to see that still figure again. Nothing appeared, yet the tension never left. Even when I finally reached the highway and the trees fell away, giving me clear sight of other cars and distant lights, the feeling lingered, a cold, nagging presence in my chest. I couldn't shake the sense that someone, or something, had marked me that night, that it had learned where I was and was waiting for me in ways I couldn't perceive. When I finally pulled into my driveway, heart hammering and sweat dripping from my forehead, I left the car running a while longer, staring into the shadows of the forest behind my house. There was nothing, of course, just trees and night. But the fear had settled in my bones. I couldn't explain what I had seen, what I had heard, or why the footprints had vanished. My rational mind tells me it was fog, exhaustion, my imagination running wild. But even now, months later, I can't shake the memory. On nights when the fog rolls in thick and the forest seems quiet, I swear I hear it again, a faint whisper carrying my name through the trees. I've never gone back to that trail, not willingly. The roads near Boone aren't well travelled, and the forest seems to guard its secrets jealously. I avoid driving there at night, and I warn friends not to. Some might think it's just a story, a weird coincidence. Maybe it was. But I know what I saw, what I felt. And the sense of dread that never left me after that night. It's in the quiet moments, the fog settling over the hills, the weight of the forest pressing in. And sometimes, when I hear a faint crackle on the radio or a sound out of place in the distance, I feel that presence again, just at the edge of my perception, reminding me that I was never truly alone on that road. I don't know what, or who, it was that night. I don't know if it was human, or just a trick of the mind, a manifestation of the forest itself. But I know that the fear I felt was real. The footprints, the whisper, the figure standing perfectly still in the fog, all of it left an imprint I can't erase. And I know that somewhere, in the depths of those Appalachian woods, the trail still waits for those foolish enough to drive it alone at night. Thick fog hugging the road like a shroud, whispering names to anyone who dares pass through. I've told myself many times that I was lucky, that I escaped without incident. But luck implies randomness, chance. That night felt deliberate. It felt like the forest was alive in a way I can't explain, aware of my presence and choosing to remind me of it. I've driven countless roads in the Appalachians since then, but the unease from that trail lingers, the memory of the headlights cutting through fog, the figure standing motionless, the footprints leading into nothing. It haunts me more than any bear, any storm, any natural danger ever could. And though the rational part of me fights it, a part of me still wonders, if I had stayed just a moment longer, if I had stepped out again to investigate, would I even be here to tell this story? I never found an explanation. There were no missing persons reports, no signs that anyone had been nearby that night. Just me, the road, the fog, and a memory I can't shake. Some nights I dream of that trail, of the figure standing in the middle of the road, watching. And when I wake, I can still hear the faintest whisper, almost a caress of sound, calling my name from a distance I can't measure. It's a haunting reminder that the mountains keep their own counsel, and some secrets are meant to stay hidden, waiting for the next traveller to drive through, headlights cutting weak beams into the fog, hearts pounding with a fear that cannot be explained. I learned that night that the Appalachians are alive with more than just wildlife, that the forest remembers, that isolation has a weight that crushes more than the body. It presses into the mind. And I learned that some encounters leave a permanent mark, a lingering unease that no amount of rationalization can erase. I drive cautiously now, always aware of the shadows, always listening for the whisper carried by the wind. I've accepted that I will probably never understand what I saw or heard, and maybe that's for the best. Some truths, I've realized, are better left unknown, lingering in the dark folds of the forest, waiting, just waiting, for the next set of headlights to pierce the fog. Even now, when the night is quiet and the mist rolls low over the hills, I feel the weight of that night. I can't explain it, I can't make sense of it, and I don't think I want to. The fear is a part of me now, a reminder of the fragility of being alone in the woods, of the unknowable presence that watches when no one else is around. And though the years have passed, the memory remains, sharp and vivid, as if the fog and the figure and the whisper were all right there with me again, waiting for a moment of weakness, for a lapse in attention, for a night just like that one. I learned that some encounters can't be rationalized, can't be dismissed, and can't be left behind. They cling like the fog, like the mud on your boots, like the memory of a whisper in the dark. And that's why, to this day, I drive those roads with a wary eye and a steady hand, because the forest is patient and the trail never forgets. Story 2: The Hitchhiker Who Vanished. It was past midnight when I found myself driving along a narrow, winding trail deep in the West Virginia mountains, the kind of road where even in daylight you'd have to hug the shoulder to avoid the trees crowding in on either side. That night, the sky was black, the moon hidden behind thick clouds, and the forest pressed against the road like a living thing, silent and immovable. I was returning from a long weekend visiting a friend in the Hollers, tired and still half alert from the long drive. My headlights cut a thin path through the dark, illuminating the damp leaves and slick asphalt. But beyond that, nothing. Every bend seemed identical. Every tree just a shadowed silhouette against the darkness. Then, about 20 minutes in, I noticed her, standing on the side of the road, thumb extended back straight, shoulders tense. A young woman, no older than mid-20s, wearing a coat that looked too thin for the night, jeans caked in mud from the roadside. She didn't wave or move toward the road. She just waited, staring at the darkness ahead, as if expecting something to appear. I slowed, instinctively, careful not to spook her. She glanced at the car, eyes sharp and strangely empty, then got in without a word. I had to adjust the rearview mirror to see her properly, and when I did, I was struck by how still she was. No shivering from the cold, no fidgeting, just nothing. I tried to speak, to break the silence. "Where are you headed?" I asked, keeping my voice light, though my chest felt tight. She didn't respond. I caught her reflection in the side mirror, head facing forward, hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed on the road as if she could already see the bends and hills before they came. A chill ran down my spine, but I forced myself to focus on the road. The trail twisted sharply, and the tires groaned over the uneven asphalt. I checked the speedometer. We were moving at a safe pace, but my hands gripped the wheel like I was holding onto life itself. The silence in the car was oppressive, thick, and unnatural, like it had a weight of its own. After a few miles, I tried again. "It's a long drive out here at night. You must be tired." She didn't flinch, didn't even blink. The forest on either side seemed to lean closer as we drove, the sound of wind through the trees almost a whisper in my ears. I felt exposed, a solitary traveler in a corridor of shadows, and yet the girl's presence in the passenger seat made it worse. I kept stealing glances at her, half expecting to catch a sign of life, a sign of recognition, but she remained as still and empty as the road ahead. Every now and then a branch would scrape against the side of the car, startling me, and I'd swear I caught movement at the edge of my headlights, just beyond the reach of the glare, but it was always nothing, just the forest breathing around us. I began to feel the dread crawl under my skin, subtle at first, then gnawing at my concentration. The smell of wet pine grew stronger, almost pungent, a scent that seemed to come not from outside but from somewhere inside the car. My pulse spiked with every turn, every shadow. I started to feel as if the girl was watching me in ways she couldn't, or perhaps ways I wasn't capable of noticing. My rational mind shouted at me that I was tired, paranoid, overthinking a simple act of kindness. But the silence in the car wasn't right. It had a presence. It pressed against me in the seat, filling the space that should have been empty except for her quiet, inert form. I glanced down at the seatbelt, half expecting it to be unfastened or twisted. It was buckled, locked in place, the metal cold under my fingers. I checked the doors. They were all locked. The girl's coat was pressed smoothly across her shoulders. No movement, no sign that anyone could have slipped from the seat unnoticed. I swallowed hard, telling myself to calm down, to focus on the road. But when I glanced in the rearview mirror a few minutes later, the shock nearly made me swerve into the ditch. She was gone. Just gone. Not slumped in the seat, not hiding under the dash. Nothing. The seatbelt was empty, smooth as though it had never been fastened. The faint scent of pine lingered, clinging to the air like a memory. I slammed on the brakes, pulling the car to the side, heart hammering. My hands shook uncontrollably as I opened the door, peering into the night. The trail stretched on in every direction, empty and silent. I called out, my voice cracking, my throat dry, but no answer came, only the wind rustling the branches. I circled the car, trying to find any sign. Footprints in the damp mud, the smear of a coat, anything. There was nothing, not a trace, not a sound, not even the impression that someone had been there. The forest seemed to swallow all evidence, leaving only the memory of her presence in my mind and the lingering smell of pine that didn't belong. I sat back in the car, fumbling with the keys, desperate to restart the engine. The dashboard lights glared into the fog, casting a sickly glow that made the road ahead seem both close and impossibly far away. I couldn't think, couldn't rationalize what had happened. My pulse was deafening in my ears. I turned the radio on, hoping for a distraction, but all I got was static. At first I thought it would help, white noise to steady my nerves. But the static was almost alive, crackling and shifting, as if whispering in tones too faint to catch. I leaned closer, straining to hear a pattern, but there was nothing. Only silence in the forest beyond the reach of my headlights. Minutes felt like hours as I sat there, chest heaving, hands still shaking. The trail ahead remained dark, twisting, familiar yet impossible to navigate after what had just occurred. I forced myself to put the car in drive, telling myself that the next bend, the next hill, would lead me back to the main road, to safety. Every mile was agonizingly slow. Every shadow along the roadside seemed to flicker in ways that made me question my vision. I kept glancing at the passenger seat, expecting to see her appear again, but it remained empty, silent, and suffocating. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had passed through the car, through the air itself. Something aware of my every movement, measuring my fear. As I drove, I replayed everything in my mind. The way she had gotten in, the way she had refused to speak, the way she had vanished. I tried to rationalize sleep, deprivation, exhaustion, fogged glasses, shadows in my peripheral vision. But nothing explained the locked doors, the fastened seatbelt, the weight of her presence, or the faint lingering scent of pine that was so distinct I could still smell it now. A rational explanation failed to settle my nerves. It only made the memory sharper, more vivid, more unnerving. The forest seemed to have folded in around me, pressing on the roof, on the car, on my very mind. Eventually, the trail opened up onto a stretch of highway, and the familiar glow of distant streetlights gave me a brief sense of relief. I slowed, taking a few deep breaths, telling myself that I was finally back in the realm of reason and ordinary life. But the relief was fleeting. Every time I glanced at the passenger seat, I half expected to see her there, staring straight ahead with those empty eyes. And even as I merged onto the main road, the image of her standing in the fog, waiting for me, returned unbidden. I stopped at a diner a few miles down the highway, shaking uncontrollably, needing witnesses, needing reality to confirm that I wasn't losing my mind. I parked at the edge of the lot, hands pressed against the wheel, and looked around. Nothing. No one saw me. No one came forward. Nothing seemed unusual. And yet, I could still feel her presence, a weight in the air beside me, the echo of a quiet, unnatural calm. I stared at the passenger seat for what felt like an eternity, half expecting movement, half hoping for it to vanish again. I couldn't explain it. My hands were still trembling when I finally forced myself to leave the car and enter the diner. Inside, the warmth and light offered some comfort, but not peace. I tried to order coffee, tried to speak normally, but my voice sounded strange even to me, tight and clipped. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone slip into the parking lot behind me, back down that narrow trail. The waitress offered small talk, but I could only nod, unable to respond with anything resembling normal conversation. The rational part of my mind screamed that it had been a trick of the fog, a hallucination born of isolation and fatigue. But the other part, the part that felt the lingering scent of pine, the memory of her eyes, the way she had occupied the seat with an unnatural stillness, refused to be silenced. When I finally returned to my car hours later, the night fully faded into dawn, the forest retreating into shadows and morning light. I still couldn't shake it. I checked the passenger seat obsessively, empty, silent, cold, but I could still smell that faint trace of pine. I drove home carefully, never looking at the mirrors, never glancing to the side, heart still hammering as if I might see her again at any moment. The memory of her vanished presence lingered like a weight I couldn't shake. Even now, weeks later, I avoid that trail at night. I avoid thinking about it too deeply. But in quiet moments, when the wind presses against my windows or the smell of pine hangs unusually strong in the air, I swear I can remember the texture of her coat, the shape of her hair, the stillness of her gaze. I cannot explain it. I cannot rationalize it. And part of me is terrified that if I ever drive that road again after dark, she will be there, waiting, silent, her presence as real and inexplicable as it was that night. Story 3. Red Eyes in the Trees. I remember that drive like it happened yesterday, though it was months ago. I was heading home from a weekend trip, the kind where the mountains feel endless and the air smells of pine and wet earth. The sun had already dipped behind the ridges, leaving only the dim glow of my headlights cutting through the thick Appalachian forest. The road was narrow, twisting and slick from a light drizzle that had settled earlier in the evening. Every turn revealed more shadows, more trees pressing close, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching toward the asphalt. I'd driven these roads before, but that night, everything felt different. There was a weight to the darkness, a presence that seemed to push against the car from all sides. About 20 minutes into the drive, I noticed something in the corner of my eye, a reflection in the glass of my windshield. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the headlights, maybe the reflection of a branch swaying in the wind. But then I realized it wasn't moving. 2 points of red light, steady, fixed, and impossibly bright, stared back at me from the tree line. My pulse spiked instantly. I slowed, hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles ached, and I tried to focus, to tell myself it was just a reflection, a deer's eyes caught in the light. But these eyes didn't blink. They didn't shift or move in any natural way. They just watched. I wanted to swerve, to throw the car into reverse and get out of there, but some irrational force kept me moving forward, compelled by curiosity and the need to know what was watching me. I edged the car closer to the center of the lane, straining to see past the glare of the headlights and the trees that pressed close. The eyes remained, glowing red against the darkness like embers in a cold fireplace. Every instinct screamed at me to look away, to drive faster, to escape, but I couldn't. My eyes were locked on them, tracing every subtle detail, even though there were none. No face, no shape, just those 2 glowing points fixed in the shadows. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, they were gone. The red glow vanished, leaving only the dark forest beyond the reach of my headlights. My chest heaved, my fingers white around the steering wheel. I tried to rationalize it, maybe a deer, maybe a reflection of my own taillights, but deep down, I knew it hadn't been any ordinary animal. There was an intelligence there, a weight in the air that didn't belong to the night. I swallowed hard, trying to calm myself, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave. Every time I glanced to the tree line, my heart jumped, half expecting the eyes to return, half afraid that whatever it was had followed me onto the road. I continued driving, the tension building with every mile. The forest seemed to press closer, shadows pooling in strange shapes along the roadside. The branches scraped softly against the sides of the car, whispering in the wind, and the faint smell of damp pine and earth filled the cabin. I felt like I was being stalked, though there was nothing tangible, nothing to confirm it. Every sense was heightened, every sound amplified. The crunch of tires over wet leaves, the hum of the engine, even my own breathing seemed too loud. I told myself to stay calm, to remember the rational world, but the forest had other plans. When I finally reached a small diner on the edge of the highway, the relief should have been instant, but it wasn't. I parked, hands still trembling, and stepped inside, hoping to shake off the lingering unease. The fluorescent lights and chatter of other patrons should have grounded me, but my mind kept drifting back to the red eyes, to the tree line, to the way they had fixed themselves on me and refused to move. I couldn't eat, couldn't relax, and I kept stealing glances out the windows, half expecting to see them again. I left the diner as dawn began to lighten the sky, trying to convince myself that the night had played tricks, that my imagination had conjured something that didn't exist. But the memory lingered, heavy and real. Even as the miles fell behind me, even as the forest gave way to familiar roads and towns, I couldn't shake the sense that I was being watched, that whatever had stared at me from the darkness remained just out of sight. I never saw the eyes again, and yet their presence follows me, a quiet unease that flares in the shadows, in the corners of my vision, in moments when the night feels too quiet and the trees too close. Story 4. The Road That Disappeared. I was driving through eastern Tennessee late one night, taking a winding trail that cut through dense forest and hills. I'd relied on this road before, but this time something felt off from the start. The way the trees leaned in closer, the way the road seemed darker than usual, even with my headlights on. I was tired from the day's trip, looking forward to getting back home before the early morning light, but the GPS on my phone started glitching. The little blue dot jumped, lagged, and finally, in a flash of static, pointed me down a narrow dirt path I didn't recognize. I hesitated, thumb hovering over the screen, but curiosity and the stubborn urge to follow directions got the better of me. I turned onto the path, tires crunching over loose gravel, and immediately the forest seemed to swallow the road behind me. The dirt trail was uneven, riddled with ruts and fallen branches, twisting tighter between the trees until the sky disappeared entirely behind the canopy. The GPS continued to flicker, redrawing my position, but no matter how carefully I followed the path, it kept insisting I was on track. Then, without warning, the road ended. Not in a fork, not a curve, not even a clearing, just stopped. Trees pressed all the way to the edge of the dirt, roots sprawling across what should have been the continuation of the path. My headlights swept over the underbrush, catching nothing but shadows and dark shapes of trunks. I swallowed hard, heart picking up speed, and tried to turn the car around. The tires slid slightly in the loose dirt, and when I looked up again, the road appeared exactly the same as before. No exit, no variation, as if nothing had changed at all. I drove a few steps forward, then tried backing up, looping in circles, but every turn brought me back to the same spot. Panic began to settle in, slow and suffocating. The forest around me seemed impossibly dense. The trees taller, closer, their branches swaying softly in a wind I couldn't feel. Time lost meaning. Maybe an hour passed, maybe 10 minutes. My phone was dead. The GPS had stopped responding entirely, and the headlights only revealed the same dirt road, abruptly ending at the same thicket of trees. I kept gripping the wheel, feeling the tires shift over the dirt, hoping that I had just missed some turn or that the next bend would open into something familiar. But it never did. The sky started to pale, the first thin streaks of dawn barely visible through the thick canopy. It should have been a relief, a signal that night was over and I could start fresh. But the road didn't change. The trees, the dirt, the abrupt ending, they remained exactly the same, as if I were trapped in some repeating frame. I pressed down on the accelerator, trying to find a way forward, a path that wasn't there, but the car moved only a few feet before the road ended again. My mind raced, trying to rationalize it. Fatigue, stress, a simple loop in the GPS. Maybe a mistake I hadn't noticed, but deep down, I knew this wasn't ordinary. Something about the way the forest pressed in, the way the shadows lingered longer than they should, felt deliberate, aware. I got out of the car, hoping that walking would give me perspective, that the road would reveal a bend I couldn't see from the driver's seat. The dirt was cold and damp beneath my shoes, and the forest smelled like wet earth and pine, pungent and heavy. I walked a few steps forward, scanning for any sign of continuation, any path that led elsewhere, but every attempt brought me back to the same point. I turned in a slow circle, disoriented, trying to mark landmarks, but the trees seemed to shift subtly, positions altered as though they were mocking me. Anxiety turned to dread, slow and crushing, as the realization set in that I might not be able to leave at all. I returned to the car, heart hammering, and tried again to back out. Every turn brought me back to the same clearing, the same abrupt end, the same impossible repetition. My hands shook, gripping the wheel until the metal cut into my skin. I shouted, hoping someone, or something, would respond, but my voice was swallowed by the dense forest. The only sound was the distant rustle of leaves, wind moving through branches that should have been stationary, a whisper of movement that didn't belong to anything I could see. I felt exposed, alone, trapped in a place that had no reason to exist, a corridor of trees and dirt with no exit. Minutes, or maybe hours, slipped by. The sky grew lighter, and still the road refused to change. I tried everything, driving in circles, reversing long stretches, even stepping out and scanning the surrounding woods for some trail I had missed. Nothing. The forest was silent except for the occasional snap of a twig somewhere beyond the reach of my headlights. The air was thick, humid, and heavy with the smell of damp earth and pine resin. I felt my sanity fraying, each repetition of the same ending pressing harder on my mind. Panic had settled in fully now, gnawing at my throat and chest, leaving me trembling as I gripped the wheel and stared at the unchanging road ahead. I thought of turning off the engine and walking, leaving the car behind, but the shadows between the trees seemed impossibly dark and deep. I couldn't see where the forest ended, couldn't judge distance, couldn't tell if the path would ever lead anywhere. The thought of stepping into the unknown, where the repetition of the road gave no clue of direction, left me frozen. I sat in the car, hands pressed to my face, trying to calm my breathing, but every instinct screamed that the forest was aware of me, that it knew I was there, and that it was not about to let me leave. Finally, I forced myself to move, pressing the accelerator and choosing a direction. Any direction, willing to drive until the tires gave out. The dirt road seemed endless, and yet each turn, each shift of the wheels brought me back to the same clearing, the same abrupt end, the same impossible ending. Light crept slowly into the canopy, enough to see the trunks of the trees, gnarled and solid, but even the sun offered no reassurance. The road didn't change, and I began to understand that this place wasn't part of the normal world. It existed outside logic, outside time, a corridor of repetition that pressed in with quiet, relentless weight. I tried to shout again, my voice echoing faintly in the dense forest, but no answer came. The birds had not yet begun their morning calls. The wind moved through the leaves. But there was no pattern, no relief. Only the constant oppressive presence of trees surrounding me. I felt like a trespasser in a place that had no tolerance for human logic or understanding. Each glance out the window seemed to show a slightly different forest, subtly altered, enough to make my eyes doubt themselves. I wondered if I was losing my mind, if the repetition and isolation had finally broken me. But the fear felt too real, too grounded to dismiss as imagination. Hours, or perhaps only a few minutes, passed as I continued to circle, always returning to the same point. My thoughts became fragmented, a mix of despair, fear, and disbelief. I imagined that I had been driving for days, that my life had been swallowed by the forest. Though rationally I knew that couldn't be true. Every instinct told me to flee, to drive harder, to abandon reason entirely and find some escape, but there was no exit. Only the forest, the dirt, and the repetition that refused to end. The weight of the place pressed on me, not physically, but mentally, emotionally, in every nerve ending. By the time the sun rose fully, the forest seemed almost ordinary again. Just trees, just dirt, just a narrow road. But I knew better. I had experienced something outside explanation, something that existed in repetition, in silence, in impossible geometry of the land. I finally managed, somehow, to drive off the trail, onto a familiar highway that opened into the first signs of human presence, mailboxes, fences, and eventually houses. The relief should have been immediate, but it wasn't. My hands still shook, my chest still ached, and the memory of that looping, impossible road haunted every glance in my rearview mirror. I never drove that trail again, and I avoid that section of the mountains entirely. I've told friends, but no one believes me. Not fully. They suggest exhaustion, fatigue, or a trick of the mind, but I know what I experienced. I remember the unchanging clearing, the abrupt end of the dirt path, the subtle shifts in the trees that made every glance disorienting. That place exists, and it waits for those who venture down its trail, ready to trap anyone who enters its repetition. Even now, when I think of it, I feel the weight of the forest pressing down, a quiet, lingering dread that refuses to fade, a reminder that some roads in the Appalachians are not meant to be traveled, and some paths, once taken, may never truly release you. Story 5, Whispering from the Passenger Seat. I was driving along a lonely stretch of forest in Virginia late one night, the kind of road that narrows until the trees on either side lean in close, blocking the sky and swallowing the light from my headlights. The asphalt was slick with recent rain, and the smell of wet pine and earth pressed into the car like a heavy blanket. I was alone, or at least I thought I was, tired from a long drive and eager to get home before the sun started rising. The forest around me was quiet, except for the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a nightbird. My focus was on the road, each bend in the narrow path feeling sharper than it should, each shadow among the trees longer and darker. It started subtly, a low murmur, almost beneath the sound of the tires rolling over wet asphalt, brushing against the edges of my consciousness. I froze, straining my ears, trying to tell myself it was just the wind through the branches, some trick of the night. But then I heard it clearly, a whisper, soft and urgent, coming from the passenger seat. My pulse shot up, my hands gripping the wheel until my knuckles ached. I glanced over, expecting to see someone, or at least the source of the voice, but the seat was empty. Just the quiet fabric and the faint imprint where the seatbelt rested. The whispering continued, low and insistent, like someone was trying to guide me, to draw me somewhere down the twisting road. I told myself to stay calm, that I was imagining things, that fatigue and the isolation of the forest were getting to me. But every few seconds the sound returned, just as clear and just as close, brushing against my ear. I caught myself leaning slightly away from the seat, feeling a weight that wasn't there, a presence pressing subtly against me. Every glance at the passenger seat made my chest tighten. The shadows in the car seemed to pool differently, shifting in ways that made me doubt my eyes. I tried talking aloud, breaking the silence in the car. "Hello? Is someone there?" My own voice sounded strange, hollow, almost swallowed by the dense night outside. The whispering paused for a moment, then returned, urging, hissing, soft enough to make me shiver. My mind raced. I thought about stopping the car, getting out, shining the flashlight across the seat and the forest beside the road. But something held me there, frozen behind the wheel, every instinct screaming both to flee and to stay. The whispering seemed aware of me, of my hesitation, pressing in closer with each breath. Hours, or maybe only minutes, seemed to pass. The road twisted and bent endlessly, the forest on either side looming and alive in ways that no ordinary road should feel. The whispering was constant now, a low, urgent murmur that seemed to guide me towards some unseen point, a turn or a clearing I could not see. I followed it half-willingly, terrified, compelled, hoping it might end, or that it might lead me out of the forest. Each time I glanced at the passenger seat, I could swear the fabric shifted slightly, as though someone, or something, was leaning closer, watching me. My fingers tightened around the wheel, every nerve taut, every sense heightened, yet I saw nothing. The road seemed endless, but eventually a faint light appeared in the distance. A break in the forest, maybe a clearing, maybe the edge of the trees. The whispering grew softer, more insistent in its urgency, and my stomach twisted with unease. I wanted to reach it, to understand what had been guiding me, but part of me feared the destination itself. Every instinct warned me that stepping out of the car, or even crossing into that clearing, would expose me to something I couldn't comprehend. Yet I felt unable to resist, compelled by the constant pressure in the passenger seat, by the low insistence in my ear. As I drew closer, the whispering suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than the voice had been, pressing in from all sides, filling the car and the space around it. I glanced at the passenger seat one last time. It was empty, perfectly still, as though it had never been occupied. My pulse was hammering, and a cold sweat had broken out across my skin. I sat there for a moment, heart pounding, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My mind offered rational explanations, fatigue, stress, imagination, but nothing could account for the sense of presence, the weight, the whispering, and the subtle, impossible shifting of the seat. Eventually, I forced myself to keep driving, putting the forest behind me, returning to familiar roads where the sky opened and the night lost some of its oppressive weight. But even as I reached the safety of streetlights and houses, I could not shake the feeling that I was still being watched, that the passenger seat still bore a memory of something there, lingering in the shadows. That night changed me. It made the quiet roads and dense forests feel less like scenery and more like corridors of unseen life, pressing in, aware, patient. Even now, months later, when I drive alone through any forested stretch, I can feel it, the subtle weight beside me, the faint whisper at the edge of hearing, and I know that whatever was in that car that night has not entirely left. Story 6. The Shadow That Followed. It was late one evening when I was driving through the rolling hills of rural Kentucky, a stretch of road that twisted and turned through dense forest with barely enough room for 2 cars to pass. The sun had long set, leaving only the glow of my headlights cutting through the darkness, illuminating the slick pavement and the low hanging mist that clung to the trees. I was headed home after visiting a friend, tired from the day's drive but wanting to make it back before night settled fully. The road was quiet, almost oppressively so, with only the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of leaves to break the silence. Out of nowhere, a deer darted across the asphalt, its form a blur in my headlights. I slammed on the brakes and swerved to avoid it, heart hammering in my chest. The deer vanished into the brush, and for a moment the road seemed calm again. But then I noticed something at the edge of my headlights. A dark figure, tall and thin, moving in the shadows just beyond the tree line. At first, I thought it was my imagination, a trick of the light or the aftermath of adrenaline, but the figure mirrored every movement I made. When I eased the wheel left, it seemed to shift left as well, staying at the same distance from my car, maintaining the same eerie parallel. I slowed, hoping the movement was coincidental, perhaps some reflection or a shadow cast by the trees, but it didn't vanish. The figure stayed there, following me, keeping pace, always at the edge of the headlights. My pulse quickened, and I gripped the wheel tighter, scanning the dark forest for any hint of a trail, a path, anything that could explain it. But the woods were solid, impenetrable, silent except for the whisper of wind through branches and the crunch of tires on gravel. Every time I adjusted my speed, the figure matched it. When I accelerated slightly to test my nerves, it vanished briefly into the darkness, only to reappear moments later, exactly where it had been, watching, pacing, mirroring me. Panic started to creep in, slow and insidious. I considered pulling over, turning around, trying to confront whatever it was, but every instinct screamed to keep moving. The darkness felt alive, pressing in from all sides, and the figure's presence only added to the suffocating tension. My headlights barely penetrated the mist, casting pale yellow arcs over the road, but the shadow stayed at the periphery, never fully revealed, never giving me a clear look. I could feel its gaze, though, sharp, unyielding, patient. The way it moved with me made my skin crawl. For miles it followed. The road twisted through the hills, the forest dense and oppressive, each curve revealing only more trees and the faint glimmer of the figure at the edge of my headlights. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a person walking along the tree line, maybe another driver hidden in the brush. But nothing made sense. The movements were impossible to synchronize with any human walking pace. It was patient, relentless, and somehow unnervingly deliberate. My hands shook, gripping the wheel as I forced myself to keep my eyes on the road and not the figure. Occasionally, I would glance quickly to the passenger side, hoping for a distraction, for some reassurance of normalcy. But there was nothing, just the empty seat and the shadows pressed tight against the car windows. The forest closed in, seemingly aware of me, of the small silver car trying to navigate its depths. I could feel every nerve ending in my body straining, every instinct screaming that I was not alone, that the figure was not just a part of the landscape, but something that had chosen to follow me, and perhaps something that wanted me to know it was there. Hours, or what felt like hours, though I couldn't tell if it was only minutes, passed in this state of heightened fear. Every time the road straightened, I would flick my eyes to the edge of the headlights, and there it was, the shadow, patient and still, keeping pace with me. When I dared to slow or stop, it would vanish into the black woods, only to reappear the instant I moved again. The forest felt endless, a corridor of trees and fog that had no exit, and the presence of the figure made every mile feel heavier, denser, more impossible. Eventually, I reached a faint glow ahead. The lights of a small town spilling weakly through the trees. Relief should have been immediate, but the figure did not vanish completely. As I crept closer, it remained at the edge of the forest, half hidden in shadows, its form indistinct but unmistakable. The knowledge that it had followed me this far, across the miles and the winding road, made my stomach knot with dread. I wanted to escape it, to leave it behind, but the memory of how easily it had mirrored me, how patient it had been, lingered in every nerve. By the time I turned onto the main highway, leaving the twisting forest road behind, I kept glancing over my shoulder. The figure was gone, absorbed into the darkness, but the sense of being watched stayed with me. Pressing quietly on the back of my mind, I reached home in silence, the engine ticking as it cooled, but sleep did not come easily. Every creak of the house, every rustle outside, reminded me of that shadow waiting just beyond the light, moving in the periphery, patient and deliberate. Even now, weeks later, I avoid that stretch of road whenever possible. I have no explanation for what followed me that night, no rational answer that can satisfy the unease it left behind, but I know what I experienced. I know how it moved, how it waited, how it mirrored me with impossible patience. The memory lingers like a weight in the air around me, subtle but unrelenting, and sometimes when I drive alone at night, I swear I can feel it again at the edge of my vision, keeping pace, waiting for me to return to the forest road that should not exist. Story 7. Distant Screams in the Pines. I was driving late that night through the back roads of North Carolina, the kind of stretch where the forest seems to press against your car from both sides, and the sky disappears behind a dense canopy of pines. The road was narrow, twisting and slick, with a light drizzle that had fallen earlier, making the asphalt gleam under my headlights. The only sounds were the tires rolling over wet leaves, the distant hum of the engine, and the occasional gust of wind stirring the trees. I'd taken this route countless times before, but something about the night felt heavier, thicker, as if the darkness itself had weight. It started quietly, faint at first. A sound carried by the wind that I couldn't immediately identify. I thought it might be an animal, a fox, maybe, or a bobcat. But as I listened, the sounds grew more distinct, more human, high-pitched, distant and full of fear. I swallowed hard, tension building in my chest, and slowed the car. The road dipped and curved, forcing my headlights to sweep across dense shadows, but there was nothing, just trees and underbrush. I told myself it was my imagination, that the forest was playing tricks, but the screams persisted, carried on the wind like echoes from somewhere far away. Compelled by a mix of dread and curiosity, I followed them, turning off the main road onto a narrow dirt trail that wound deeper into the forest. Each bend seemed to draw me closer, but every time I neared where the sounds seemed strongest, they faded, replaced by an unnatural silence that pressed against the car like a physical weight. I rolled down the windows, letting the cool, damp air rush in, but the screams didn't return. They only lingered in the corners of my mind, leaving a residue of panic I couldn't shake. The trail narrowed further, the pines growing taller and closer, branches brushing the car as I passed. My headlights caught glimpses of movement at the edge of the beam, shadows shifting just beyond the tree line, but when I focused, there was nothing. The forest was perfectly still, yet the feeling of being watched pressed in on me from all directions. Each time I stopped to listen, the silence felt heavier, a tangible presence that made my skin prickle and my chest tighten. I kept driving, following the faint memory of the screams, each step forward a mix of fear and compulsion. The road twisted, rising and falling, and every dip seemed to swallow sound entirely. The further I went, the more isolated I felt. No birds, no insects, not even the wind seemed to move in the same way anymore. The forest had become a living, breathing entity, and I was the only intruder. My pulse hammered in my ears as I strained to hear anything at all that would explain the sounds. Hours, or maybe only minutes, passed in a fog of tension. The trail ended abruptly in a small clearing, the trees forming a tight ring around a patch of damp earth. I stepped out of the car, flashlight in hand, trying to pinpoint the source of the screams. The beam swept across the clearing, revealing nothing but broken branches and disturbed leaves. The wind whispered softly through the pines, carrying a faint echo of the earlier cries, but there was no one there. Not a figure, not a movement, not even an animal. Just silence, thick and suffocating. I sat in the car for a long time, heart racing, hands trembling. Every instinct told me to leave, to turn back toward the road that led to safety, but something held me there. The memory of the screams, the way they had seemed so close yet vanished each time I approached, anchored me to that spot. It was as if the forest had been toying with me, aware of my presence, aware of my fear. Every creak of a branch, every rustle of leaves made me jump, expecting the sound to return, but it never did. When I finally forced myself to drive back toward the main road, the forest seemed unchanged, yet somehow heavier. The mist hung lower, and the shadows clung tighter to the edges of my headlights. I didn't hear the screams again, but the memory of them stayed with me, echoing faintly in my mind every time I closed my eyes. Even now, months later, when I pass through North Carolina's backroads, I can't forget the way the pines whispered in the wind, carrying distant cries that seemed real and human, yet impossible to find. The forest holds its secrets, and I learned that night that some sounds are meant to fade, leaving only the lingering weight of unease. Story 8. Headlights in the Mirror. It was sometime after midnight when I started the climb. I'd left a friend's place down in the valley later than I meant to, and now I was paying for it. The road ahead twisted up through the mountains, a 2-lane strip of cracked asphalt with no guardrails, and just enough space for one truck to squeeze past another without tumbling into the dark nothing that fell away on the left. The old forest pressed tight on both sides, tall pines and black oaks standing like sentries, their branches leaning in overhead. The only light was my headlights cutting a tunnel through the dark, catching raindrops from an earlier storm still clinging to the air. I'd driven this road plenty of times before, but that night it felt different, quieter somehow. Even the wind seemed to be holding its breath. I kept one hand on the wheel and the other resting on the gearshift, my eyes flicking between the yellow lines and the cliff edge. I wasn't nervous exactly, just focused. Then I checked my rearview mirror and my stomach tightened. Headlights. 2 pale circles burning through the dark maybe 50 yards back, right in line with my bumper. At first, I figured it was just another late-night driver heading up the mountain, but there was something about the way those lights held steady that set my teeth on edge. No swaying from the rough road, no glint of chrome, just 2 unblinking eyes burning through the mist. I tapped the brake lightly, hoping they'd either back off or pass me, but the lights didn't change. I pressed the gas and took the next curve a little sharper than I should have. The tires hummed against the cracked asphalt. The headlights behind me followed perfectly, neither gaining nor losing distance. Every curve I took, they took. Every straightaway, they matched my speed exactly. It was like looking in a mirror. The higher I climbed, the narrower the road got. The forest thickened until it felt like I was threading a needle between black walls. Every so often, my headlights would catch an old, leaning fence post or the half-rotted stump of a tree long cut down, and my brain would snap to thinking it was a person standing there. My heart was working harder now, breath shallow, palms slick on the wheel. I thought about pulling over and letting them pass, but there weren't many spots wide enough to stop without dropping a wheel into the ditch, and the idea of them pulling over with me, that froze me more than the road itself. I kept going. A mile or so later, I saw a narrow dirt trail veering off to the right, just wide enough for a car. I cut the wheel sharp, letting the gravel pop under my tires. My headlights caught the white slats of an old gate half buried in weeds before the trail curved into the trees. For a split second, I felt relief. I'd lost them. Then I checked the mirror. The headlights were there, Perfect distance, perfect speed. It was like they weren't following me so much as they were tethered to me. The trail was rougher than I expected. Potholes hidden under puddles, branches scraping against the sides of my truck. The lights behind me didn't bounce, didn't flicker. They just floated. I drove deeper into the forest, telling myself I'd find some old logging road or turnoff that would take me back to the main route. But the further I went, the less the place looked like any part of the mountain I knew. The trees here were older, their trunks gnarled and black, the ground rising and falling in strange ways that made it hard to tell if I was going uphill or down. And the headlights, always there. At some point, I stopped checking the clock. Time didn't feel right anymore. The road seemed endless. My hands ached from gripping the wheel, and every muscle in my legs was locked tight. It could have been 20 minutes or 2 hours. I couldn't tell. The forest outside my windows had gone completely silent. No crickets, no wind, just the sound of my own engine. Somewhere ahead, the trail opened into a wide, flat stretch. A pull-off maybe, or an old work site. I thought about gunning it, seeing if I could lose them in the open, but something about that space felt wrong. The ground was covered in tire tracks, but none of them were fresh. The far end disappeared into the trees without a sign of where the road picked up again. That's when I noticed. The lights behind me weren't quite the same color as mine. They had a faint yellow tinge, like old halogens, but dimmer. Almost as if they weren't lighting the road so much as they were lighting. My chest tightened. I floored the gas, skirting the edge of that flat clearing, and dove back into the trees on a path I wasn't sure was even a road. My headlights swung wildly, catching glimpses of something pale between the trunks. Maybe just birch bark, maybe something else, but I didn't slow down. When I looked in the mirror again, the lights were gone. I didn't believe it. I kept glancing back, every curve, every straight stretch, waiting for them to flare back into existence. The forest felt heavier now, pressing in tighter, and the dark behind me seemed thicker than the dark ahead. I didn't know if I was heading back toward the main road or deeper into the mountain, but I couldn't make myself stop. It was grey by the time I hit pavement again. The forest thinned, and a line of distant ridges appeared through the morning mist. My shoulders slumped in relief, but I couldn't shake the feeling in my gut, that heavy, gnawing dread, like I'd been led somewhere I wasn't supposed to see, and then let go. When I finally pulled into my driveway hours later, the sun was fully up. I sat there with the engine running, staring at my own reflection in the rearview mirror. The road behind me was empty, but I swear, just for a second, I thought I saw 2 faint yellow circles fade away into the morning haze.